certainly there are a lot of highs. I mean, getting drafted was one of them. Playing in the finals, winning a couple of personal awards, I guess you could consider, as the highs. But yeah, certainly an epic amount of lows, and injuries being probably the biggest one. Obviously bad form, being dropped from the senior team, and I guess probably underpinning those lows was, suffering in silence from a myriad of mental health issues, which I really struggled with, during my time in the game.
Welcome to the Things You Can't Unhear podcast. I'm your host, Maritza Barone. In this show, I will introduce you to ideas, concepts, and mindsets that will open your mind to a new world of well-being and personal life growth. Through eye-opening interviews, we elevate people in the world doing amazing things for humanity and share insights that will shift you to become the happiest, healthiest, kindest, and most compassionate version of you. Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of Things You Can't Unhear. How are you today? How are you today, really? Now, it's quite interesting that we autopilot to just saying, good thanks, how are you? When someone asks us that question. But when you ask it again, just like I did, it really makes you stop and think and gives you the opportunity to answer honestly. So, how are you today, really? Now, I've certainly had some ups and downs this week. It's 6 weeks into lockdown here in Fiji, and I'm starting to feel a little bit frustrated with how slowly things are improving. And I'm trying to find new ways and old ways to navigate through that frustration. I find, though, talking about how I'm feeling definitely helps. And as mental health is such a big topic on this show, we need to make sure we are opening the conversation wherever we can. So today, why don't you go out and ask someone in your life that question? How are you really? If you need a little help getting the conversation started, Conscious Conversations have some amazing conversation starter cards to spark deeper discussions and get others to start talking on this level. You can find them online at consciousconversations.live, and I'll put the link in the show notes. So on the show today, we are joined by Brock McClean, a former AFL player who played 157 games at the highest level with Melbourne and Carlton. Now, as an elite athlete at the top of their game, there can come some incredible highs and also some incredible lows. Brock has had a turbulent on and off-field life, and after years of suffering in silence with mental health issues and physical injuries, Brock self-medicated to get through the pain and began to notice the toxic relationship he had with drugs and alcohol. After what he calls hitting several rock bottoms, he has now come through the other side and completely changed his life. In this episode, he shares his journey of healing with us, including looking at his upbringing, his experiences, and his transformative realisations, and the alternative medicines that he believed helped him to heal and understand his past behaviours. There's something in this episode for everyone. So let's jump into our chat with Brock McClean. Hello, Brock. Thank you for joining me today on Things You Can't Unhear. It's great to see you.
No, thanks for having me, Maritza. I'm really excited about having a chat today.
Now, where are you joining us from?
I'm in beautiful Melbourne at the Parisian end of Collins Street. So just in my work office, a new gig which I started last week. So it's a new journey that I'm about to embark on.
Oh, new journeys are always exciting. What are you working on at the moment?
So I've just stepped into a role with a company called Armitage Private, who are sort of an independent fund manager in a relationships manager role. A new line of work and a new adventure for me.
Huge transition from the days on the footy field, I'm assuming.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of, skills that you can apply, which is sort of, made you quite good at what you do and apply in a business aspect as well. So it's just about, learning to apply them in a mental manner rather than a sort of a physical manner as I was used to doing on the football field.
Amazing. Well, I'm glad you've joined us today because I'm excited to talk to you about mental health and the advocacy that you're following at the moment, and speaking up about your own experience. We have global listeners on this show, so there may be some people who don't know your career history. You've played 157 games for the AFL, and I know as an elite athlete there would be some epic highs and of course some quite epic lows. So can you tell us about your career firstly, and maybe a bit about the balance between those highs and lows and how you manage them?
Yeah, I guess, I grew up in a big football family. Like, my pop played professional football, my uncle played professional football. My dad was on his way to playing. So ever since I was a little kid, that's all I wanted to do. So everything that I did, when I was a teenager, was in the aspirations or in the goal of sort of playing AFL football. So to be able to live out my dream was something that I've only really been able to appreciate quite dearly. But, started my career at Melbourne. I guess at the age of 20, I felt like I had the world at my feet. I was really coming along in terms of my playing development. So that was sort of in an extreme high for me. But, from there on, there was, the extreme lows. Like, in the following year, I broke my foot. And then I think the year after that, I had to have ankle reconstructive surgery. Maybe a year or two later, I had both knees operated on twice. And that was when I transitioned to Carlton. So, yeah, certainly there are a lot of highs. I mean, getting drafted was one of them. Playing in the finals, winning a couple of, personal awards, I guess you could consider, as the highs. But, yeah, certainly an epic amount of lows. And injuries being probably the biggest one, obviously bad form, being dropped from the senior team. And I guess, probably underpinning a lot of all that, those lows was, suffering in silence from a myriad of mental health issues, which, I really struggled with, during my time in the game.
So what made you start to get vocal about your experiences and your struggles? I know you've shared many interviews now about your journey and the low moments that you've encountered. What was that trigger to make you start vocalizing it?
Someone just reached out to me one day, a person in the media, and said, would you like to come on your podcast and speak about your sort of experiences with your mental health? And I'm, pretty stable mentally, and I'm happy and I'm healthy, and, I felt like a good opportunity to give back and sort of, raise awareness. And, especially coming from someone who's, in a professional sporting landscape, there's a common misconception out there that, only a certain sector of the community suffers from mental health, and that doesn't apply to elite athletes or people in position of prominence. So it started out just probably doing it for that reason, but then the sort of the two byproducts of that have been, it's been such a cathartic experience for me, talking to people about my experiences and really opening up emotionally and putting yourself in a vulnerable position, talking to complete strangers. And there's a real sort of healing aspect to that as well, and sort of reliving some of these emotions. And then I've almost been like a front row passenger, witnessing my own story again, and seeing where I started, and where me a real opportunity to sort of reflect on my journey as well, and realize how far I've come as little as sort of 2 or 3 years ago, or probably when I was at my rock bottom. So that's given me the perspective and allowed me to sort of reflect on how much work I've put in and how far I've come, and to give myself a pat on the back for that, because that's something that I haven't been able to do well in the past, is recognize when I've done well. So it's given me the chance to be able to reflect and practice some some self-gratitude and self-compassion as well.
I'm so glad that you are in a good place right now and are feeling quite centered and good about yourself, and that self-love is coming through thick and strong. I mean, there was definitely a turbulent off-field life for you as well. It wasn't all about the sport and the pressures of that. There are a lot of things like drugs and alcohol that you bounced to when tough moments came into play. Was that the rock bottom moment for you when the drugs and alcohol began to take over your life?
There were times where I felt like, it can't get any worse than this. But, much to my surprise, 6 months later or 12 months later, I felt like I'd hit another rock bottom. And, it probably wasn't until 2 years ago that I'd really hit that, I felt like I couldn't go any lower than what I was. But in terms of, my relationship to alcohol and drugs, I guess probably started more so with alcohol, probably started when I was a kid. And, I grew up in a very sort of old school type of family where, a lot of the males in my family or in my life, they were heavy drinkers, and they drank to excess. So I sort of grew up thinking that was the norm. That was my perceptions of the way that people drank. So I grew up thinking, that's how, everyone drank. So every time I drank to excess. And, that became a real coping mechanism and a coping strategy for me. Whenever things got difficult mentally or emotionally, was, suppressed, or I numbed, or, I self-medicated. And then when that started to stop working, that was when my drug use sort of became a lot more problematic. I would never touch drugs if I wasn't drinking, but anytime I'd have a few drinks, your inhibitions are down, your decision making is affected. So I would turn to drugs as another sort of self-medicating sort of strategy. So, part of telling my story is that you don't just, start off by becoming a really problematic alcohol and drug user. Like, it gradually decreases and, falls away over time. So I guess, looking back now with the benefit of hindsight, I could really start to see when things started to get bad for me. And it sort of coincided when I was dealing with a lot of those epic lows that I spoke about before, injuries and being dropped and, stuff that I would never, ever complain about or never speak about. I just turned to the bottle. I turned to the powder to try and deal with those issues. So, and then, it finally got to a point about 2 years ago when I was just like, no, I just can't possibly feel any lower than this. I can't, something needs to change. My relationship with alcohol and drugs needs to change. My perspective needs to change. And my attitude to recovery needs to change. So that was when I, quit my job just to purely focus on myself and get myself right. So that was my true rock bottom moment. It was probably a bit over 2 years ago.
Do you feel like there's a lot of other players in the same boat at the moment, playing within the AFL and feeling the same way and having these same experiences, turning to these vices to sort of numb the pain and help them through difficult situations and injuries and whatever comes with being an athlete in this game?
Yeah, look, I certainly think we just, athletes fit into sort of the broader society's problems. And, my experience is, I've had 2 stints in the Melbourne Clinic, which is a psychiatric hospital in Richmond here in Melbourne. And, talking to a lot of people in those settings, and it's pretty much the same type of, stories. People who struggle with, certain types of trauma, or they're struggling with certain types of mental health issues, they turn to alcohol and they turn to drugs, and as a way of a coping strategy or coping mechanisms. And certainly elite athletes and specific to my experiences, AFL footballers fall into that category. So I certainly think that there would be a lot of other players out there who would be going through similar situations, struggling with injuries or struggling with their own mental health issues, and they'd be turning to sort of self-medicating strategies. There was a certain stage in my life where I felt like that was all numb my emotions or completely switch off to what I was experiencing at the time. But, those moments were very, very short-lived. But because they worked for a period of time in my life, I actually attached myself to those behaviours. And I think that's such a common thread when you're talking about anyone in society who's dealing with those types of issues, that we attach to these behaviors because of it for a period in our lives, albeit very shortly. They actually worked and they actually helped us escape our problems or numb our emotions and our feelings.
What was your support network like around this time? Did you have people in your life that you could count on and talk to help you through some of these difficult times?
Yeah, one of my biggest issues, and one of the reasons why I struggled so much, was because I just had this mindset of, that if I, speak up, or, if I put myself in a vulnerable position and say that I'm struggling, or, ask for help, it's a huge sign of weakness. So that was, one of my biggest struggles for a long time, is, feeling like I would be a burden, to the people closest to me, to my family and friends, or feeling like they would think of me in a much lesser context, because, I just thought it was a sign of weakness to put my hand up and ask for help. So, I mean, there are such good resources for players to be able to access mental health services, or speak to their club doctors, or speak to league doctors about, or club psychologists about, their mental well-being. But in saying that, if you're not ready to ask for help, or if you're not ready to access those help, then those sort of resources and guidelines are pretty much wasted opportunity. So it wasn't until I really reframed or shifted my perspective on the way that I viewed vulnerabilities, the way that I viewed putting my hand up and asking for help, or the way that I viewed my support network. Once I shifted my perspective on those things, then there was a real, I was able to heal a lot more effectively and efficiently. And I was able to leverage and use my support networks, and use the people who are closest to me, most important to me in my life, to be able to, one, help with what I was going through. Two, they could practice empathy with me. And three, I could really start to heal, because, I was putting my story out there to the people closest to me. And, just speaking to them and connecting with them in that regard, enables a really sort of, can set you on a healing journey.
Definitely. When you speak up and you allow people that insight into how you've been feeling and what you have personally experienced. I mean, a lot of people can have their own perception of you without you even saying a word, being, in the public eye as you were, and reading different articles that are published about you and stories. So I think it's so powerful that you're actually speaking up and talking your own truth, and healing yourself in the process of that. Now, you did turn to help. You went and you saw a psychologist. Was that the first step to healing for you?
Yeah, I guess that was the first step. The very first step was like, well, there's an acknowledgement of, that I'm not well mentally, and first step to that was to start seeking help. So I almost went, I wouldn't say reluctantly, but I had a lot of reservations about what this would do for me, or how I would perceive myself in that regard. So it was like a small step, I guess. And, it really took me a long time to open up, like, honestly and authentically, and to really let my guard down with him, and to establish, a proper, trustworthy relationship with him. Like, I struggled to talk openly and honestly to the people that were closest to me, my mum, my dad, my sister, my friends, extended family. So, talking to a complete stranger openly and honestly about my problems was something that was going to take a bit of time. But, the therapeutic process, or the psychologist aspect, is something that just, it takes time. Like, it took me a proper, I reckon, 4 years to get to a place where, through a lot of talk therapy and initiating small little changes along the way. And I guess that's, early on why I struggled with my recovery, was I was expecting to get better, within the space of 4 to 6 weeks. I was treating it like I was working on a deficiency skill, like in a football setting. And, so I had these unrealistic expectations. So, once I started to look at things from a long-term perspective and really temper my expectations, that was when the healing process really started to begin, taking such a long-term approach to it, and a long-term mindset, that, along the way you are going to experience setbacks, and you're not going to be this perfect human being that doesn't make any mistakes. So that there was a real process of shifting my mindset in that regard as well, of, just because I made a mistake, I'd had a setback, doesn't mean I was on the path to my recovery. And my psychologist gave me a really good analogy to use. I was working finance at the time, and he was like, think of your recovery as like a share price chart, for a stock that you cover. Like a stock price never goes in a straight line northeast. There are peaks and troughs along the way, but as long as the general trend is sort of heading in that upward northeast direction, then you're on the right path. So you can sort of step back, and when I looked at it in that regard, I was like, I've got to think of this in a long-term perspective. So, the healing started with, started seeing a psychologist, but once I tempered my expectations, I was able to start to look at things in a much more long-term process rather than, quick fixes or expecting to be healed, in 2 to 3 months.
It definitely would be a process. Did you find that there were triggers to your setbacks that you could identify and make sure that you didn't fall back into old routines?
I guess there were certain people in my life that would trigger, certain emotions or certain memories, which, weren't very conducive to my recovery. So a period of my life, I had to make the hard decision and cut those people, from my life, not because of any, sort of personal vendetta or any sort of hatred towards them. It was like, well, you're just not good for me, and you're not good for my health while I'm in such a vulnerable state. So it was important for me, to separate them, from my life. And as hard as the decision was, it was in the best interest of me. So that was one thing. But again, when I, being a professional athlete, sometimes we have, a lot of us have this perfectionist mindset and this hypercritical attitude towards ourselves, that if we make a mistake, or that if we're not perfect in something, or if we have a really good game, we tend to focus on the negative rather than, the positives as well. So I took that approach to my life as well. So I guess, whenever I made a mistake, or whenever I had a setback, or whenever I, regressed in some to those, those not idealistic behaviours, then I would sort of go, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, you're this awful person. You're not going to get better. You're making mistakes. Have a look at you. You're regressing. And that was when I reverted back to those behaviours that I spoke about before, in terms of, running to alcohol and, abusing drugs and, self-isolating and shutting myself off from the world. So I guess those were, what triggered me, I guess, in, reverting back to those really, toxic and problematic behaviours.
Wow, it definitely sounds like an incredible pathway you've been on, and like we touched on earlier, you look like you're in an amazing place right now. You look happy, you sound balanced. You're in a strong relationship. I know your fiance very well. You've got a new job, things are going well for you, and I believe you've been off alcohol for quite a period of time as well.
Yeah, so it got to it, looking back now, and I look at my, sort of my recovery, and, how my attitude just changed towards alcohol, just gradually over time. And it got to a point where, I wasn't drinking as much as I was, but I was still going on binges. And I'd been in Barbados at a mate's wedding, and it was effectively like a week-long bender. And I was at the airport, and I was feeling so disheveled, and just I felt like I was sort of back in my old sort of ways. And I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to have a month off alcohol. I'm just going to give myself a break and see what happens, really just cleanse myself. And then, at the end of the 1 month mark, I was like, oh my God, I feel absolutely amazing. And I'm really enjoying this. Like, I prefer, not drinking compared to drinking. And then I read a book called This Naked Mind by an author by the name of Annie Grace. And she was an American marketing executive, I think marketing. And anyway, she detailed her journey on the road to sobriety. I think, a lot of these industries, these, high performance, high pressure sort of white collar jobs, there's a huge element of alcohol related to it. So she detailed her journey, but she also wrote a lot of facts about alcohol, and, how, it's the only drug that we have to justify not taking, in society, and, just the truth about what it does to us physically, what it does to us mentally. And I felt like the book just came to me at the really right time, and I learned all this stuff about alcohol. I was like, what am I doing? Why am I actually putting this poison into my body? And especially someone who has a mental health issue, it's a psychoactive depressant, so it makes us more depressed when we do drink, and it kills more people than illicit and prescription drugs combined. And I think a study done by the World Health Organization a few years ago highlighted that it's the number one cause of death for males aged between 18 and 55. I think so. Having all the facts at hand and learning the truth about it as well really sort of solidified my position on not drinking, and it just became quite easy to do after that. And I do have the occasional drink, with my partner. If we are out for a nice dinner, or an anniversary or a birthday, I will have a glass or two of wine with dinner. Just more of a social connection type of thing. But in saying that, it really still does taste like poison. So it's sort of like a force, to drink the wine down. But I do it because I enjoy sort of the connection that the social benefit I derive from doing it with Steph.
And changing your relationship to it, I think, too. I mean, there's different ways of drinking, and not everyone sort of goes down that path of that binge drinking and that poisonous type of take on drinking. Whereas, the way that you've changed that relationship, and you can still have a glass or two of wine with dinner with your fiance is pretty strong, actually, because you're not taking that to the next level, and you're not being triggered by that.
And it's part of like a shift to this, it's much more balanced approach to things and balanced mindset, whereas previously I was all or nothing, so one's too many and 100's not enough. So, previously I couldn't have, one or two drinks and just leave it at that. It was like, God, if I have one, then bang, we're going on a 4-day bender. Whereas now, it's part of that, that balanced approach to things, whether that's diet or alcohol or everything in my life, just being a little bit balanced about it, not being that all or nothing mindset. So it's very helpful to approach things in that regard as well.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, along with the services that the psychologist helped you along with, were there other big drivers of healing for you? I know you've used a mixture of traditional and alternative medicines.
Yeah, so I guess when the proper healing started was, so 2 years ago when I spoke about before I'd hit rock bottom, I was like, right, I quit my job. I was like, let's stop addressing symptoms. Let's get to the root of the issue. What is the actual core of my issue? And that revolved around self-worth. So, I'd been speaking to my psychologist about it for quite some time, issues around self-worth, but I could just never view myself or foster a good relationship with myself the way that I had with, the people closest to me. I was so empathetic and compassionate and loving and caring to the people closest to me, but I could never turn that inward. I could never sort of foster that type of relationship with myself. So there was a real sort of breakthrough moment where I was listening to a podcast, and it was with a lady called Kristen Neff, and she's like probably one of the leading researchers, or probably one of the bigger gurus in the world of self-compassion. And I listened to a podcast by her, and she was talking about, people who, the research shows that people who struggle with self-worth and self-compassion, I know they might have had this happen to them when they were children. I fell into one of those categories. And straight away, I just felt this massive, sense of relief, and that I could stop blaming myself for how I was towards myself. I kept blaming myself that I couldn't develop this, loving and compassionate relationship with myself. So straight away, I was able to start practicing self-compassion. I was like, oh my God, there's a reason why I'm like this. It's not your own fault. Now, it wasn't like I was looking for anyone to blame, but it actually allowed me to practice self-compassion. And I just actually started massively crying at the time. It was just like this massive emotional release. So that was the first step, on a big set of stairs on the road to recovery and on the road to fostering a self-compassionate relationship with myself. So I guess that was the first step forward. And then, along the way, it's just been like a real sort of holistic approach to getting better, so it has been, fostering a good relationship with myself. It has been, about, eating well and not drinking and abstaining from drugs. But, in terms of alternative sort of treatments, there was a couple of years ago, I read a book called How to Change Your Mind. It was by Michael Pollan. And it was basically, a quick guide into sort of the history of psychedelics and how they've played a role in, Eastern philosophical traditions and, shamanistic cultures and, ancient indigenous cultures as well, and how they've been so amazing and therapeutic in people with sort of mental health issues. So once I read that book, I was instantly hooked. So I started going down I went into the rabbit hole, and I'm still down there. It was something that I was very open and honest about with my psychologist, and he was very open and receptive and very warm to my interest and desire to sort of undertake these therapies. So so I did a couple of sessions on sort of LSD. I did it by myself, so it wasn't exactly in a therapeutic setting, but understanding the importance of set and setting, and how important that is to the therapeutic benefit of these medicines. Apart from sort of my daughter being born, it was probably the most profound experience I've ever had in my life, in the sense that I just really connected with nature. And I was going through a period that I was quite anxious about the future, and anxious about am I going to be all right? What's going to happen to me? I feel good now, but is this going to last forever? But this almost like this major epiphany, or this like sort of light bulb moment happened under the sort of my LSD session. It was like, this connection with the universe and the cosmos.
I've heard many similar stories where, people have had the same outcomes to you and had these massive realizations about their lives, and maybe the trauma that they've encountered, the ancestral trauma that they didn't even know about, that could be healed from generations before them.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. As I was saying before, like my healing really started to kick off when I addressed the core of my issues. Do you know what I mean? And whereas sort of the Western psychiatry model, we prescribe drugs that just help deal with symptoms. So again, it's just another form of, I guess, self-medicating, in the fact that, we're just suppressing emotions and we're suppressing symptoms. And we know from the research, and we know from, what was observed, certainly from a personal perspective, that it doesn't work. The only way that healing can really happen, and for us to be free of these sort of issues, if we address the core of our issues. And that's what psychedelic therapy, that we're able to access these repressed emotions, or these repressed traumas, or these repressed memories, and we're able to relive them in such a safe space that we can therapeutically work through these and then integrate them, with our psychologists and with our psychiatrists post sessions. That, the results show that, I think the latest stage 3 clinical trials for MDMA for PTSD show that set with 67% are in remission 12 months afterwards. Like, they're completely symptom free. So those types of numbers are absolutely amazing. And again, it gets to the issue is we're able to, get to the core of the issues. And those are these traumas or these memories that we're suppressing. They're underpinning a lot of these mental health sort of neuroses and conditions. So again, there needs to be a shift in how we're treating like such the big problem that we're experiencing in mental health issues. And I firmly believe that psychedelic therapy is not a panacea. I wholeheartedly believe that, but I think that can be another tool for us in being able to fight, the scourge of mental health that we're experiencing today.
I think you touched on something really important too. You did them with the use of your psychologist and other healing practitioners. And I think that's really important, because you can open a can of worms by doing this, and, touch on past experiences and traumas that you may not feel as though you were ready to deal with. And I think having someone hand in hand with you to help you, guide you through that, and not just being left with this information and a can of worms just spilling over and you trying to sort of navigate the best way to take that all in and bring that into your life. I think that's such an important aspect of using these alternative medicines.
Yeah, well, I think, one of the really important parts of sort of psychedelic therapy is the actual therapy part. Like, you gain some amazing insights from the session itself, but those are all wasted. And if you don't actually integrate them, into your everyday life and don't actually, learn from your experiences as well. So that's such an important aspect, and being really disciplined in your approach to these things. Like a lot of the reading that I did, I made sure I had as much information at my disposal as possible. And, they talk about the two most important things: your set and your setting. So if your mindset's not right, or if you're not in the right setting, your physical setting, or, your environmental setting, then, if those two things were never sort of ticked off on, then I certainly wouldn't have undertaken or participated in. So there's very much a disciplined approach to it as well. Another a big reason of sort of speaking up and telling my story is that there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way, in particular, males perceive the word vulnerability. Like, I think, my experiences of growing up in the old school type of family that I did, it was, you associated vulnerability with weakness, when in fact it's the complete opposite. Like, to be able to open yourself up to someone, or to say to someone, what, I'm struggling, and to put yourself in a vulnerable position like that is a huge sign of strength. And I think if we can really make some inroads into shifting our relationship to that word and how we perceive it, especially in the male sector of the community, then that'll go a long way to sort of destigmatizing this sort of alpha male role, or this, that it's weak to speak up for males, or it's a sign of weakness, when in fact it's a huge sign of strength. So vulnerability is such an important term, and learning to embrace vulnerability. And once we do that, we can really start to heal. And I think that the positives certainly outweigh the negatives by a big margin.
Totally. When you sit back and you look at your life and where you were and now where you are, what makes you most proud?
Well, I made this comment on, you can't ask that on the ABC, that, I'm so much more proud of the journey I've been on, and all the experiences that I've had, that I've gone through and sort of come out on the other side. I'm much more proud of that than I was of, achieving my dream and playing football. And it's not to say, I'm in a position now where I can look back on my career fondly and realize, what I achieved. And, that was a huge thing for me. But, it's not easy. It's not easy to change. And I think, you'll find that most people in society are sort of reluctant to change, and, are just happy to keep going on it, and in about their ways. But it takes, a lot of dedication, a lot of hard work, to be able to unlearn, toxic and bad behaviours and relearn new ones. But at the same time, it's a possibility. And, as I said before, talking about, my story has allowed me to really appreciate the journey that I've been on, and how far I've come, and the changes I've made in my life. And, I'm extremely proud of that. And, something that I will be proud of for the rest of my life.
Do you have any regrets about the past?
Look, no, I don't. I actually don't. It's, it's amazing sometimes, I catch myself sitting there thinking, what would your life been like if you had had these insights, 10 or 15 years ago? You would have been so much more, set up, or, your life trajectory would have been so different. But then, my reasonable brain comes back into focus. Like, well, hang on, you only have these experiences, you only have this perspective, you only have these insights because you've gone through this lived experience. So, I mean, I certainly, my journey has been hard, but I mean, I don't regret anything about it, because, because of my experiences and because of the stuff that I went through, that I'm able to have this insight, and I'm able to be in the position that I am. And experience is definitely the most powerful educating tool, that we have. I mean, you read about something in a book, but once you actually go through it personally and physically, and, experience it in a practical sense, then that's when you really develop an understanding and good insight.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so thrilled that you're in such a good place right now in your life, and that the road back has been so positive for you. So wishing you all the best, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Maritza. Thanks for having me, and all the best to you.
Thank you for listening to the Things You Can't Unhear podcast. I'd love to keep the conversation going. Let us know what you thought of this episode, and if something profound came up for you that you want to share, let's talk about it. You can find me on Instagram at Things You Can't Unhear, or on my personal page at Maritza_Barone. And if someone you know will benefit from something that was said in this show, make sure you share it with them too. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and keep up to date with what's next. And if you can spare a few seconds, please rate and review the show on iTunes, just so other people can find us more easily and quickly. And as always, my friend, be happy, be healthy, be conscious, and be kind.